Hello, boys and girls. So today we're going to be talking about pacing. Pacing is the rhythm of the novels or stories or the chapters and the scenes and the paragraphs and the sentences that you are reading. It's also the rate at which the reader reads and the speed at which the story events occur and unfold. So when we're talking pacing, a lot of you think of like the pacer mile, like it's when you're pacing when you're running. You don't want to run too fast because you're going to tire out. You don't want to run too slow because you're never going to get there. So having a good pace or knowing when to speed up and when to slow down within writing a story is really important. In order to impact your reader, you can change the pacing of your story. So for example, shorter sentences make your reader read faster. They feel as if their story is moving faster because they might read, run, go quickly, hurry up. You're able to read faster, so it feels like whatever's happening with the characters is moving much quicker. So you can play with that pacing and manipulate it so that the reader has a different kind of experience. You also have a way of slowing down your reader. So one way to slow them down is to put an emphasis on a moment. So it's kind of like throwing a vignette into the middle of your story. You want to share a lot of detail, like sensory detail. So talk about smells and tastes. You're really going to emphasize that little moment. And when you have a lot of those really descriptive words and powerful words, it slows your reader down and makes them focus in on something. And then on the flip side, you can go back to speeding things up with dialogue. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when you're reading something with dialogue in it, you read much faster because it's kind of natural for you to want to have the conversation to move as it should, like we would in real life. So there's lots of hills and valleys within our stories, and today we are going to listen to a story. It's called, let me see what it's called. It's called The Raft by Jim LaMarche, and we are going to kind of dissect it of what kind of hills and valleys this author has decided to put in there to either speed up or slow down his story. So here we go. Maybe.
The Raft by Jim LaMarche.
A note from the author. This story is like the cigar box I kept as a boy. It's full of bits and pieces of my boyhood summers. Like Nicky in The Raft, I spent those summers with my grandparents at a cottage in the North Woods. My grandma was a self-taught artist and a fine fryer of perch and bluegill. Also, like Nicky, I once found an old raft. It happened one day when my dad and I were running our dog, Brownie, in the rolling hills near town. We came to an abandoned camp where we found a small artesian pond with water coming up from underground springs as cold and clear as glass. In the weeds along the shore, we found an old raft and a smooth pine pole. Much to my surprise, my dad let me take the raft out of the pond by myself. And again, like Nicky, I discovered the power of drawing and learned that when you draw something, you get closer to it and know it better. This story is a little about all those things: a summer in the woods, a special grandparent, becoming a river rat, and becoming an artist. "There's nobody to play with," I complained. "She doesn't even have a TV." Dad grinned. "Well, she's not your normal kind of grandma, I guess," he said. "Calls herself a river rat," he chuckled. "But I promise, she'll find plenty for you to do. And you know I can't take you with me this summer, Nicky. There'll be no kids there, and I'll be spending all my time at the plant." I felt tears starting again, but I blinked hard and looked out the window. That afternoon, I stood in Grandma's yard and watched my dad drive away. Dust rose up behind our car as it disappeared into the pines. "Well, we can't stand here all summer," said Grandma. "Come on, Nicky, it's time for supper." "Honey or maple syrup on your cornbread?" Grandma asked. "I don't like cornbread," I mumbled, poking my finger into the syrup pitcher when she wasn't looking. "If you're going to do that, you better wash up first," she said. She had eyes in the back of her head. "Bathroom's through there." I pushed the doorway curtain aside and walked into what would have been a living room in anyone else's house. Books were scattered everywhere, on the tables, on the chairs, even on the floor. 3 of the walls were cluttered with sketches and stuffed fish and charts of the river. Several fishing poles hung from the 4th with a tackle box, a snorkel, and a mask on the floor beneath them. It looked like a river rat's workroom, all right, except that in the middle of everything was a half-finished carving of a bear. "Been carving that old fellow for years," Grandma called from the kitchen. "The real one hangs out at the dump. Now come get your supper before I feed it to him." Dad was right. Grandma found plenty for me to do. In the morning, I stacked firewood, then helped her clean out the rain gutters and change the spark plugs on her truck. The afternoon was almost over when she handed me a cane pole, a bobber, and some redworms. "Fish fry tonight," she said, showing me how to bait the hook. "That river's full of fat bluegills. Drop your line near the lily pads and you'll find 'em." Down at the dock, I looked things over. The lily pads were too close to shore. There couldn't be fish there. I walked to the end of the dock and threw my line out as far as I could. Then I sat down to wait, and wait, and wait. My bobber never moved. "There's no fish in this stupid river," I said out loud, disgusted. We had hamburgers for supper. "Give it another try," said Grandma the next evening. "I'll bet you catch something." Don't count on it, I thought as I headed back to the dock. I threw my line in the water. Then I stretched out on the dock to wait. I must have fallen asleep because I was awakened by loud chirping and chattering. I sat up and looked around. A flock of birds was moving toward me along the river, hovering over something floating on the water. It drifted downstream, closer and closer, until finally it bumped up against the dock. Though it was covered with leaves and branches, now I could tell that it was a raft. What was it doing floating down the river all by itself, I wondered. I reached down and pushed some of the leaves aside. Beneath them was a drawing of a rabbit. It looked like those ancient cave paintings I'd seen in books, just outlines, but wild and fast and free. I cleaned away more leaves, and it was like finding presents under the Christmas tree. A bear, a fox, a raccoon, all with the wild look of the rabbit. Who had drawn them, I wondered? Where had the raft come from? I ran up to the cottage. Grandma was on the porch reading. "Do you have some rope I can use?" I asked. "In the shed, hun," she said. "Help yourself." She didn't ask me what I needed it for, and I decided not to tell her yet. I pushed the raft into the reeds along the river's edge, then tied it to the dock so it wouldn't drift away. All the while, birds flew over my head, every now and then sweeping down to the raft as if it were a friend. A crane waded through the reeds to it. A turtle swam up from the bottom of the river. The moon had risen yellow over the river by the time I went up to the cottage to go to bed. I was already down at the dock the next morning when Grandma appeared with a life jacket and a long pole. She didn't seem surprised by the raft at all, or by the animal pictures all over it. "How did you know?" I started. "Let's go," Grandma interrupted, tossing me the life jacket and stepping onto the raft. She pushed the pole hard into the river bottom, and we moved smoothly into the current. "Your turn," she said after a few minutes. She showed me how to hold the pole and push, and I pulled us to the middle of the river. Even there the water wasn't over my head. We pulled the raft up the river and let it slowly drift back down. The birds kept us company the whole time, soaring, swooping, singing. Some even landed on the raft and rode with us for a while. Hitchhikers, Grandma called them. After that, I had little time for anything but the raft. I raced through whatever chores there were, then ran down to the dock, wondering what animals I'd see that day. It wasn't just birds that the raft attracted. One morning, 3 raccoons followed me along the shore. Another time, a turtle climbed on board and spent the morning sunning itself. And one afternoon, I saw a family of foxes slip through the trees along the river. When the weather turned too hot and sticky to sleep indoors, Grandma helped me put up a small tent on the raft. I lay on top of the cool sheets and read comic books by flashlight until I fell asleep. One night, a noise woke me up. There in the moonlight stood a huge buck. He looked right at me, then lowered his head to drink as if I wasn't there at all. I found Grandma the next morning working on her bear carving. "Do you have some extra paper I could draw on?" I asked her. She brought out a big sketch pad and a pouch filled with thick pencils and crayons. "I've been saving these just for you," she said. "Better take these too." She held out the snorkel and mask. Never know when they might come in handy on a raft. The sun was hot that afternoon, so I pulled into the shade of a willow, then waited to see what animals the raft would bring. It wasn't long before a great blue heron whooshed down with a crayfish in its bill. I grabbed a pencil and began to sketch. I felt invisible as the bird calmly ate its lunch right in front of me. Then it preened its feathers, looked back up the river, and flew off. That night I showed my drawing to Grandma. "Not bad," she said. "Not bad at all." And she tacked it on the wall on top of one of her own sketches. One day I pulled upriver farther than I'd ever been. Near a clump of tall cattails I startled an otter family. They dove underwater, but, as with the other animals, the raft seemed to calm them down. Soon they were playing all around me. Grandma had been right about the mask and snorkel coming in handy. I slipped them on, then hung my head over the raft and watched the otters play. Chasing fish, chasing each other, sometimes just chasing their own tails. I kept very still, but they didn't seem to mind me watching. They played keep-away with a small stone, then tug-of-war with a piece of rope. It was like they were showing off for me. They even let me feed them right out of my hand. Some mornings, Grandma would make a bag full of sandwiches and a thermos of icy lemonade. Then we'd put on our bathing suits, grab some towels, a lawn chair, and an inner tube, and pull upriver to her favorite swimming spot. "I've come swimming here since I was a girl," she told me as we tied the raft to an old dock. "The Marshalls used to live here, all 10 of them. What a herd of wild animals we were." While Grandma watched from the inner tube, I practiced my flying cannonballs. Then we'd eat our lunch, and she'd tell me stories about growing up on the river. My favorite was at the time she'd found a small black pearl inside a river clam. "I still have it," she said. Somehow, on the river, it seemed like summer would never end. But of course it did. On my last day, I got up extra early and crept down to the dock. The air was cool, and a low pearly fog hung over the river. I untied the raft and quietly drifted downstream. Ahead of me, through the fog, I saw 2 deer moving across the river, a doe and her fawn. When they reached the shore, the doe leaped easily up the steep bank, then turned to wait for her baby. But the fawn was in trouble. It kept slipping down the muddy bank. The doe returned to the water to help, but the more the fawn struggled, the deeper it got stuck in the mud. I pushed off the river bottom and drove the raft hard onto the muddy bank, startling the doe. Then I dropped into the water. I was ankle deep in mud. "You're okay," I whispered to the fawn, praying that the raft would calm it. "I won't hurt you." Gradually the fawn stopped struggling, as if it understood that I was there to help. I put my arms around it and pulled. It barely moved. I pulled again, then again. Slowly the fawn eased out of the mud, and finally it was free. Carefully I carried the fawn up the bank to its mother. Then, quietly, I returned to the raft. From there, I watched the doe nuzzle and clean her baby, and I knew what I had to do. I pulled the stub of a crayon from my pocket and drew the fawn, in all its wildness, onto the gray boards of the raft. When I had finished, I knew it was just right. After supper, I showed Grandma my drawing of the fawn and told her my story. "It's perfect," she said, "but we need to do one more thing." She hurried up to the cottage. When she came back, she had tubes of oil paint and 2 brushes. Grandma helped me trace my drawing with the oil paint, which soaked deep into the wood. "That'll keep it," she said. "Now you'll always be part of the river." Just like you, Grandma, I told her. A river rat. Grandma laughed. Just like me, she agreed.
Okay, boys and girls, so that is The Raft by Jim LaMarche. What I'm going to do is I am going to show you how to, well, if I can figure this out, how to plan for a story using the Hills and Valleys pacing guide. But I'm going to use The Raft as like my go-to as far as how to pace it out. So when you go to write a narrative story, again, remember the other day we talked about it being that there's more than one event that happens. You've got interesting built upon characters that go through different challenges. You've got a beginning, you've got a middle, you've got an end, and you'll have kind of like a lesson as well. So when we're doing this, I want to kind of go over all of that, but also make sure that we talk about how they planned this out originally. So when you're using one of these, they can be really, really simple. So we know at the beginning of the story, he was very unhappy about Grandma's house. All right, then the author goes into talking about just how bored he really is. So right here, I'm going to write, Nikki is super bored. Okay, so yep, he was unhappy, he's bored, but then something happens, and it's going to be at the very top of the point. So when the first big event happens, so in this, two bigger events are going to happen, and which they did in the story. So for example, this one, the first big event is Nikki finds, I'm not using full sentences because this is just like a planning sheet. Nikki finds the raft. Okay. He goes on lots of adventures on the raft. Adventures. And let's see what happens next. His grandma travels with him. Grandma goes with him. And you'll notice this is kind of when things kind of die down. Him and his grandma are visiting. They're enjoying what's going on. But then something else happens. Right, guys? We're getting back to a different event, a different problem in the story. So I'm going to move that down just a little bit. Okay. Nikki sees maybe not Nikki sees. How do I scooch this over? Come here. Nope. That didn't work. Okay, maybe I'll use my pen. Nikki. That works. Okay. Sees a deer in trouble. Okay, and then what does he do? Of course, he helps the deer. And then finally, he draws the deer on the raft. And then the ending, you could say, like, he kind of is the theme of it is the fact that he should give things a chance, I would say. And things aren't as bad as they seem, might be your theme. So there is a strong conclusion because him and his grandma talk about how he is just like her. He's a river rat too. Okay, so when you go to write a narrative, I want you to think about this planning sheet and how there are hills and valleys in a good story. It's not just one problem happens and it's solved. Typically, you'll get to know your characters better when they go through more events. Does that mean you are going to be writing chapter books? No. But like this story, there are more than one event that your character goes through. So go ahead and try to, you guys don't have to have the exact words, but go to your digital notebook and fill in one of these with the raft. Make sure you put the raft to help you remember. And then later on, when I ask you to write narratives, then you can use the right side over here to help you plan. Okay? All right, boys and girls, until tomorrow.